Good morning students. Mechanical weathering mainly occurs because of the following reason. That means mechanical weathering mainly occurs by the following reasons. First is temperature, second is a frost, third is a crystal growth, and fourth is a release of pressure, and fifth is a water. First is a temperature. Hmm? These are the elements which are responsible for the mechanical weathering. First is a temperature. The minerals in the rocks expand because of the heat and contact. When the temperature decreases due to such continuous contrasting and expanding tension developed in the rock's particle, each minerals react differently to the temperature. Some minerals expand more while others do not expand as much. Consequently, the tension formed in the rocks also increase and decrease. As a result, cracks developed in the rocks and they break in area where the diurnal range of the temperature is higher. Weathering of this type is common in the hot desert. That means first element which is the responsible for the mechanical weathering, temperature. That means in the mineral in the rocks expand because of the heat and contrast when the temperature decreases. That means the mineral in rocks expand because of heat also increase or decreases due to such continuous contrasting and expanding. That means this temperature also increase and decreasing. That means they are expanding and contrasting. Tension developed in the rocks particle at that time. This tension expanding on these rocks. At that time the tension developed in the rocks particle. That means the temperature, because of this temperature or the because of this temperature, sometimes in the rocks continuous contrasting and expanding. That means the temperature is also increase or decreases, and tension developed in the rocks particle. At that time the tension created on this rocks particle, each minerals react differently to the temperature. That means mineral react with differently to the temperature. That means at that time the temperature is increased, the minerals react with different, and the temperature is decreases. At that time the minerals react with the differently. Some minerals expand more. At that time the when these minerals react with differently in a increased temperature and decreased temperature, some minerals expand more. That means some minerals are expanded more and some minerals are not expanded as much, and consequently the tension from in the rocks also increase and decreases. That means at that time the tension created on these uh, rocks is also increase or decreases. As a result, cracks developed in the rocks. That means at that time cracks occurs on these rocks and they breaks, and at that time this tension created on the rocks also increase and decreases, and this is a reason behind it. This cracks developed in the rocks and they are break in the area where the diurnal range of the temperature is higher. Weathering of this type common in the hot desert. That means this is a weathering occurs in the common in the hot desert. Second main element is a frost. You know that the volume of the water increases when it freezes. That means when at that time the water is freezing, at that time volume of water is also increases. You know very well. In area where the temperature drop below 0 degrees for quite some time, water accumulated in crack and crevices in the rocks freeze. In the volume increases, that leads to the tension in the rocks and they scatter. That means when the volume of the water increases when it is freezes. म्हणजे ज्यावेळेला एखाद्या वॉटरची व्हॅल्यूम वाढली जाते त्यावेळेला काय होतं, ते ॲटोमॅटिकली काय होत जातं, ते फ्रीजेसला असतं. म्हणजे वेन इट इज फ्रीजेस, अँड ॲट दॅट टाइम त्याची ही पण काय वाढलेली असते, व्हॅल्यूम पण काय वाढलेली असते. वेन द टेम्परेचर ड्रॉप्स बिलो 0 डिग्रीज क्वाईट सम टाइम, आणि ज्यावेळेला ड्रॉप्स बिलो किती असतात, 0 डिग्रीज असतात. वेन वॉटर ॲक्युमुलेटेड इन क्रॅक्स, ॲट दॅट टाइम इन द रॉक्स दे वॉटर ॲक्युमुलेटेड ऑर cracks, and the crevice in the rocks freezes. In value increases, this leads to tension in the rocks and they shattered. That means at that time the tension is created on the rocks increases, value increases of this lead tension at that time the rocks they are shattered, shown in figure 3.1. Third is a crystal growth. Crystal growth in rocky coastal wave hit the sea cliffs. The water is alkaline. Some water droplet hit and cracks in the rocks. That means crystal growth. That means the rocky coastal. The wave hit and sea cliffs. The water is alkaline. Sometimes droplet hit and cracks in the rocks. That means at that time the water is alkaline. These drops goes to the rocks and water droplet hit and cracks in the rocks, and at that time they created cracks on the rock. In this alkaline water, the soluble material in the rocks get dissolved. That means in the alkaline water some soluble material in the rocks get dissolved. This leads to formation of small holes in the rocks. म्हणजे त्या alkaline water मुळे काय होतं, soluble जे मटेरियल आहे ते रॉक्सला गेट काय करतं, डिझॉल्व करतं आणि त्या रॉक्सला काय क्रिएट करतं, होल्स क्रिएट करतं. दिस इज इफेक्ट ऑफ सोल्युशन अल्काइन वॉटर गेट स्टोर्ड इन दिस होल. काय होतं ते alkaline water gets stored in this hole, and this alkaline water stored in this hole, because of heat this water turn into water vapor and only crystal of alkaline material remain in these rocks. That means the because of heat this water is evaporated or water vapor is created, and only crystal of alkynes is remaining on these rocks. Crystal occupy more space, and at that time this crystal is occupied or occupied many space. This causes tension in the rocks. Hole are formed in the rocks in the look like the honeycomb, and at that time this rocks as like a honeycombs. Here the given the figure alkine crystallines also, you understand. And these rocks also like a honeycomb, म्हणजे ते एखाद्या मधमाशाच्या पोळ्यासारखं दिसतं. Next is the release of pressure. It is not that tension is created in the rock only because of the temperature, freezing of the water or crystalline. The outer layer of the rocks exert pressure on the inner or lower layer. When this pressure ceases to exist, the lower or inner layer get frees from the. This is also lead of weathering. That means it is not that tension is created in a rock only because of temperature, freezing or water crystalline. That means release in pressure. It is not that the tension created on rocks only because of the temperature, freezing water or crystalline. The outer layer of the rocks exerts pressure on the inner or lower layer. That means the outer layer exerts the pressure on the lower layer. When this pressure ceases to exist the lower and inner layer, that means at that time the outer layer exert the pressure of the inner layer. At that time this pressure is exist lower or inner layer get free from the pressure, and it is also lead of the weathering. Next is the water. Some areas experience more rainfall than other. In such areas, shooting or rocks water is also causes weathering of the some rocks like sandstone, conglomerates. The rocks are formed because of the pressure. That means the different places rainfalls is different, and the rocks water is also causes weathering of the some rocks like sandstones, conglomerates. Their rocks are formed because of the pressure. On the agglomeration of the sand particles, mud also makes and the particle come together. When the water penetrates such rocks, these particles get loose and separate from the main rocks. This is called as a granular weathering. That means the rocks particles separated by the that means agglomerations and sand particles. Mud also makes sound particles come together. Sands particles come together. When these penetrates such rocks in, the particles get loose and separate. That means these particle of these parts is loose and separated from each other, or main from the main rock. This is called as the granular weathering. Sometimes both temperature and water are responsible for the weathering. That means sometimes the sometime both temperature and water also responsible for the weathering. Different expansion widenings the joint or the cracks in the rocks. Water accumulated in the such wide joint and big block of rocks separated from the each other. That means at that time the water accumulated in such wide joint in big blocks rocks separated from the each other. This is called as the block distributions. Next next type of the weathering is a chemical weathering. Take a glass of the water, put the pieces of the chalk is in it. On the next day, observe what happened to in the answer of the following questions. That means you doing this experiment in your home and write down observation in your notebook based on this following question. Here given the second activity, wrap few iron nails in a wet cloth. Open the clothes after 2 days. Observe what happened and answer the following questions. That means you doing this experiment or do this experiment in your home and observation write in your notebook based on this question and answer. Water play an important role in the chemical weathering. Rocks is a mixture of many minerals. Water is universal solvent. Many things get dissolved is water play an important role in the chemical weathering. Rocks is a mixture of many minerals. That means water is a play an important role in the chemical weathering. Rocks is a mixture of many minerals. That means the rocks is made by the many minerals. Water is a universal solvent. That means water is a universal solvent. That means many of elements which is dissolved in the water. Many things get dissolved in the water. The solubility increase because of the matter has dissolved in the water, and those material which do not dissolve easily in the water get dissolved in such solution. Areas receive heavy rainfall. Chemical weathering occurs in the following ways. That means the water is the universal solvent. The many of elements or many of the things which dissolve in the water, but which things do not dissolve in the water easily, dissolve in the water, get dissolved in such solution. Areas receive heavy rainfalls. Chemical weathering, there is a chemical weathering is occurs. First is the carbonations. The rainwater travels through the the rainwater travels through the atmosphere before reaching the grounds. Carbon dioxide is the air get mixed on the water. In this process, dilute carbonic acid get from the material like limestone get easily dissolved in such acid. For example, water plus the carbon dioxide is equal to carbonic acid. H2O plus CO2 is equal to H2CO3. That means here given the chemical reaction. That means in the rainwater travel through the atmosphere. At that time, the carbon dioxide mixed on this water, and this process dilute carbonic acid get from the, and at that time here that means water H2O and carbon dioxide, that means CO2 is combined with each other, and then carbon carbonic acid, that means the here given the chemical reaction H2O plus CO2 is equal to H2CO3, that means the carbonic acid is created. This is known as the carbonations. Second is the solutions. Some minerals in the rocks get dissolved in the water. Limestone is formed due to chemical precipitation between the water and alkynes. That means some minerals in the rocks get dissolved in the water. That means on the rocks some minerals which dissolved in the water, and limestone is formed due to the chemical precipitations. Precipitations means rain. Limestone is formed due to chemical precipitation between the water and alkane. At the Vadgaon Darya in Ahmednagar district, limestone get precipitate chemically. That means here given the example of the given the at the Vadgaon Darya in Ahmednagar district, limestone get precipitated chemically, undergoes chemical weathering against, and then chemical weathering also again. Similarly, because of the solution, alkane in the rocks dissolve and make them bristles. That means similarly because of alkane solution and alkane is in the rock dissolved and make the brittles. Next is the oxidations. This process occurs rocks which have the iron present in them. What is the oxidation? Here given the process occurs the rocks with the iron present in them. The iron in the rocks come in contact with the water. That means here given the oxidation process. That means in the rocks the presence of iron, and this iron is rocks come in contact with water, and the chemical reaction takes place between iron and oxygen. That means the iron is contact with the water, and in between, that means in the iron and in the water, the chemical reaction takes place between the iron and oxygen. Hence the reddish color layer from the rocks. That means at that time a reddish layer of the rocks is created. This is called as the rust, and this is also known as the rust. When you keep nails in wet cloth, you must have noticed a similar thing. That means you kept nails in the wet cloth, you must have noticed a similar things. Similarly, process occurs in the rocks with the high rainfall. That means similarly this process is created by the high rainfalls. There are many more processes involved in the chemical weathering beside the one mentioned above. Daily life example included moisturing of the table salt in rainy season, apple slice turning brown, etc. Here given the some other example of the chemical weathering in the daily life, including moisturing of table salt in rainy season, and here given apple slice turning brown. This is the example related to our daily life. Thank you.